the world is utterly dependent on the expression of God. Right? If it were not for God speaking the world into existence, at every moment the world simply would not exist. And the world has no existence really independent of this divine speech. The world is nothing for itself. Because it is created something from nothing, it is therefore utterly dependent at every moment upon God's involvement and God speaking it into existence. And if God were to cease speaking the world into existence, even for a moment, it would return to how it was before the creation, into absolute nothingness. It's the fundamental point of chapters 1 and chapter 2. The reason why we have two chapters, as I've said many times now, is that chapter 1 expresses this idea based on Torah and based on, so to speak, more based on faith propositions, that we know these things because the Torah tells them to us. Chapter 2 was more of an exploration trying to understand it and explain it to our own minds, explain it to our own intellects, of why this must be so, as the Alter Rebbe goes through, that if the world has created something from nothing, then it must be that God is constantly involved in it. Inasmuch as anything about God must be, this must be, that God's involvement is constant and He is constantly speaking it into existence. Chapter 3, which we began last week, goes a step further. Chapter 3 explores what the universe is given that it is here. Right? In other words, we were speaking about how if God were to stop speaking, then the universe would be absolute nothingness. The question chapter 3 aims at or intends to answer is, so what is it now that God is speaking it into existence? Right? If God were to stop speaking, the universe would be absolute nothingness. There would be nothing here. True nullity, not. There would be nothing here at all. However, there would be no here, even. There wouldn't be anything at all. There would just be God. Now that God is speaking it into existence, the question is, so what is here, now that He is speaking? Right? In other words, what is the universe now? I understand what it would be if He were to stop creating it. Now that He is creating it, what is it? Is basically what chapter 3 aims to answer. And last week we said the chidush, we said the innovation of chapter 3, the fundamental thing that chapter 3 adds to our understanding of the unity of the world with God over chapter 1 and chapter 2. The new thing that's added in chapter 3 is that in chapter 1 and chapter 2 we said, without God there is nothing. Chapter 3 is going to come and explain to us how even with God there is nothing. In other words, what is the universe even now that God is speaking it into existence? It is nothing other than God Himself. Even with God creating the universe, even though He is speaking it rather than not speaking it, the universe is truly nothing other than God. It cannot be considered as an independent reality in any sense, even as He speaks it into existence. The very fact that He is speaking it into existence, as we will see, necessitates that what is it? It is completely and utterly united with God. And the nature of that unity and why that is so is what we discuss in chapter 3.
So in essence, what you're saying, what Alter Rebbe says, is that the reality that man believes he perceives is only reality to those who are not learned in Chassidus.
It's the reality to those who do not know how to see the truth of things. We spoke about that last week as well, that if we were given permission to see, that's what we would see. We would see that the universe is absolutely nothing outside of God. The universe is simply an expression of God, and if you were to really be able to see into the truth of things and into the depth of things, you would see, if you were asked what is the universe, you would be forced to say nothing other than God. That is the answer to the question. In order to explain this idea, we brought a metaphor from a mirror, from a person's reflection in a mirror, right? There's two, to distinguish between the dependence of the universe upon God from chapter 1 and chapter 2, and this new dependence of the universe upon God that we're talking about in chapter 3, we brought a metaphor of a mirror, a reflection in a mirror. The reflection in a mirror is really like chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 3 adds something else. How is that so? You would never say that a person's reflection in a mirror, this is also a review from last week, you would never say that a person's reflection in a mirror fundamentally exists. Only there is a condition to its existence, which is that a person has to be standing in front of the mirror. Right?
And it has to be seen.
No, but you wouldn't say that, I'm saying. This is the incorrect way of looking at it. The incorrect way of looking at it is the reflection is in the mirror. There is a condition that a person needs to stand in front of it for the reflection to be present. But the reflection is fundamentally in the mirror. Right? This is the wrong way of understanding it, because obviously, what is obviously the case is not that the reflection is in the mirror, right? The reflection is an expression of the person who stands in front of the mirror. It's not that the reflection is there and is brought out or has a conditional existence that a person stands in front of it to bring it out. The reflection fundamentally does not exist until the person puts it there by standing in front of the mirror.
Only the reflective power, the material.
Correct, exactly. And fundamentally, if there were a mirror all around us, everything would reflect us, right? Because it's an expression of the light coming from us, right? In other words, it is only there because we are there. It's an expression of us. When we stand in front of the mirror, there is a reflection because we are being expressed in the mirror. Now, the reflection in the mirror is utterly dependent on the person standing there, is what we're saying. In other words, it has no existence outside of the person standing in front of the mirror. It is totally dependent. And if the person were to not stand in the mirror, it would be as if the reflection was never created. Yes? So in other words, it's very similar to how we're describing the universe in chapters 1 and 2. That fundamentally, the universe does not exist, essentially. Right? There is no presumption of existence. There is no prior existence on which the universe depends. There is no what's the word I'm looking for? There's no assumption. There's no established status quo that the universe should be. Right? It's just like the reflection. The status quo is that the universe shouldn't be. Right? So why is there a universe? Because God came and expressed himself and made a universe. God speaks it into being. And if God were to cease speaking it into being, it would totally cease to exist. Yes? Chapter 3 says that the universe is not like a reflection in a mirror. Why? It says this metaphor is fundamentally flawed. It's fundamentally faulty. Why is this a flawed metaphor? Because when the person is standing in front of the mirror and the reflection is in the mirror, they are fundamentally two separate things. You have the person and you have their reflection. And they're separated fundamentally by space. You have the person, if you were in the room looking at the person and their reflection, you could point your finger to one and say the person is there and not there. And the reflection is there and not there, right? In other words, the reflection and the person clearly are in two separate spaces. So now, although the reflection is utterly dependent on the person to exist at every moment, it's utterly dependent on the person standing in front of the mirror for it to even exist. Once it is here, what is it? It has fundamentally, at least conceptually, in space, it exists separate from the person. You have the person, and then you have the reflection. In chapter 3, we are going to argue, essentially, with an extended metaphor that's quite subtle and complicated. We're going to argue that creation something from nothing is not like this. Creation something from nothing would be as if the reflection is within the person. There is no separation at all in space. You can't say the reflection is there and the person is there. There's only one thing. There's the person, and then there's the reflection, and they're in the exact same space. And we're going to discuss what space is in this metaphor. We're going to get to that. So what will come out eventually from this whole discussion is that the universe, even now that it is here, is nothing other than a God, right? As if the reflection were in the person. There is no mirror. There is no place to which you could point to say the universe exists here separate from God, right? The universe and God are in the exact same place and are utterly united in that sense. And that's fundamentally what we're going to argue in this chapter. So let's go further in the actual text, I think. We'll go further. We're on page 8. 53.
Okay.
In the English, we're going to start with, and in the English it's an illustration, v'hamashal.
Okay.
3 lines up from the bottom, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
V'hamashal is an illustration of the bittul, of the nullification of the universe before God. Hu hashemesh hameir la'aretz v'ladarim. It comes from the light of the sun, which shines upon the earth and those who dwell upon it. Shehu ziv v'er hamispashet meguf hashemesh. The light of the sun is a ray and a light which extends from the body of the sun, right? Meaning to say from the sun itself. And everyone can see how it shines its light upon the earth and in the expanse of the universe, within space, it shines its light. V'hine, zeh pashat. It is simply understood, says the Alter Rebbe, she'er v'ziv hazeh, that this light and ray, yeshne gamkein beguf v'chemer kader hashemesh, exists also in the body and material of the orb, the globe of the sun itself, shebeshamayim, in the heavens. She'im mispashet umeir lemercha kol kach, because if it shines to such great distances, kol shekein sheyuchol leheir b'mekemei mamish, all the more so is the light able to shine within the sun itself. Okay, pause the reading there. We have a metaphor. The metaphor is going to be different than the metaphors we used in chapter 1 and chapter 2. It's going to be different than the splitting of the sea or the throwing the rock up into the air, right? Those, we're actually going to show what the problem is with those metaphors, why those metaphors actually are imperfect metaphors for creation something from nothing, even more than we thought previously. We have a new metaphor. It's the famous metaphor known as the ray of the sun in the sun, which is very famous. It's mentioned here in this chapter of Tanya. It's also mentioned in chapter 33 of Likutei Amarim, of the first part of Tanya. It's a famous metaphor of the Alter Rebbe, the ray of the sun in the sun. Now, it's actually a logical argument, a logical progression, if you take it step by step. Alter Rebbe is saying as follows. He's making a metaphor. The sun shines its light upon the earth. That's the first step, very non-controversial. The second step is to say that if the light shines on the earth, the light must exist within the sun as well. What exactly that means within the sun as well, we're going to get to at much greater length. But let's take the first part, right? He's saying that whatever that means, that it exists within the sun as well, he's saying it in a way of kal v'chomer almost. If the light is able to shine so far from the sun on the earth, then all the more so it must be within the sun, right? This already is in distinction with the way creation at a human level works, right? Which is really called formation, not creation, right? The way a human being creates something from something, right? We're going to have 3 things. We're going to have 3 things by the end of this discussion. We're going to have creating something from something. We're going to look at the light that comes from the sun, and we're going to look at creating yesh ma'ayin, creating something from nothing. We have 3 things. Creating something from something, right? Like, let's take the metaphor we've been using for human creation, right? You have the silver. You have the block of silver. It's formed by the silversmith into a vessel, let's say a menorah, right? And the whole point is that he can go walking in the market and the vessel remains, as I'm sure you remember, because he only really changes the form of the silver. He makes the silver be in a different way rather than really truly creating it, and therefore his role in its creation is really limited. He just brings out a potential that's within the silver. He doesn't really create anything new, fundamentally, right? That's all what we said before. So imagine that a person was totally unfamiliar with the material world in general. A person is totally unfamiliar with silver. He's never seen silver before, nor an object made of silver, right? And he comes and he looks at the silver menorah that's sitting on this stall in the shuk, right? He knows, at least, or someone told him, or he knows from looking at it, that this must be an artifact made by a person, right? A person formed this thing, right? Or he's told that it's not a naturally occurring thing. So the question is, which aspects of these things, from looking at the silver menorah, which aspects of the menorah are attributable to the craftsman? Again, just looking at the menorah, being unfamiliar with the material from which it's made, or the way in which it's made, or anything like that. If you were to ask him which aspects of this thing come from the craftsman and which come from the material, right? He would be hard-pressed to answer.
No, we'd have to, well, yeah.
Just looking at this thing, right? So for example...
If he's looking at it in a vacuum.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Theoretically, right? Theoretically. The point is that because of the very nature of creating something from something, of human formation, there's really at least two factors that go into the creation of each and every thing. There's the material from which it's made, which pre-existed the craftsman's involvement. Mm-hmm. And there is the form, or whatever it is, that the craftsman gives to this material. Right? So in other words, if I were looking at the silver menorah and I had never seen silver before and I'm looking at it in a vacuum, right, I might think that the silvery color is what's given to it by the craftsman. Maybe the shape of the menorah is naturally occurring. Maybe that's how silver is found in the ground. Maybe the silvery color is what the craftsman does. Maybe it's a very ugly, rusty color when it's in the ground. And he puts it in an oven and works with it, and it makes it into this beautiful... color. You could do the same thing with diamonds, right, which actually do need to be polished by the craftsman and made into their full color and glory through cutting and everything. So in that case, it's even more subtle, right? What's naturally occurring, what's in the substance, and what does the craftsman add, right? In other words, everything in the physical world that is created in a process, something from something, is really an amalgam, because the whole definition of something from something is that it doesn't come entirely from me as the creator. Right? I'm making something from something. So there is a prior step to my involvement. There is something already existing before I get involved. Therefore, when I look at the menorah, not knowing anything else, I cannot say for certain which aspect of the menorah existed previously by the craftsman. Right? In other words, the craftsman could be in possession of its color and given it its color. Or he could be in possession of its shape and give it its shape, which is really what the silversmith actually does, right? But I don't know fundamentally which is which, because I know that whatever I'm attributing to the craftsman may just be attributable to the material or the starting point, the previous step in the process with which the silversmith works. Yes? So, as opposed to creation something from nothing, right? There is no prior existence to which any aspect of the final creation can be attributed, right? If I look at the good evening. If I look at the wallet, right? If I look at the wallet, right, and I know that the wallet has created something from nothing by God, ultimately, right? So I understand there were humans involved along the way. Let's not get to that, right? A rock is easier, but I don't bring a rock to class. So if we look at the wallet and we know it's created something from nothing by God, right? We know that everything about it must be attributable to God. There is nothing about it which is attributable to anything other than God. God is not just the sufficient source to create the thing. He is also the necessary source of the thing. Yes? Pardon me. He's the opposite. He's not just the necessary source of the thing. He's not just necessary in the process of creating it. A silversmith is necessary to the process of creating the menorah as well. He is also the sufficient source of the thing. God and God alone is enough to produce this thing. This thing in its entire can come from God, right? As opposed to the menorah, which the menorah entire cannot come from the silversmith.
It could come from God.
Yes, well, everything could come from God, right? But the menorah, only some aspects of the menorah can come from the silversmith. Other aspects, fundamentally, must come from the pre-existing thing. We're on page 853. So there's a fundamental difference between, in this sense, creating something from nothing and creating something from something. So therefore, creation is just like the ray of light that comes from the sun. We're making a logical argument, right? What's the logical argument? The logical argument is that if I see the ray of light from the sun, I know for a fact that there is nothing other than the sun that is creating this light, right? The sun doesn't need the vacuum in space. It doesn't need the object on which the light falls, right? The source of this light is purely and singularly from the sun. Therefore, I know that the sun must have light within it, right? Well, again, exactly what that means we're going to discuss. But because the thing as it exists now is 100% with no remainder attributable to this source, therefore it must be found within that source. Therefore it must be found within that source. Right? Because because it only has one source, therefore everything that is within it must be found in its source, because where else otherwise would all these aspects of the thing come from? Right? Therefore, what are we really saying? What are we really saying? We're really saying an idea which is found elsewhere in Chassidus, in some of the deepest and most profound Maimarim and talks of the various Rebbeim. We're fundamentally saying that with regards to God, there is no difference between potentiality and actuality. Again, with regards to God, there's no difference between potential and actual, his ability to do something and the actual doing of it, right? For example, let's take the silversmith again, right? These ideas are connected, I want to show you. They're all entangled with each other. You have the silversmith. The silversmith, right? Silversmith plus silver equals menorah, right? So it's only a necessary cause, but not a sufficient one, because you need the silver as well. What does this also mean? This means, it's sort of, you have to look at it in a slightly different angle, that the silversmith had the entire ability to create the menorah, and yet he was only able to create it when he got a block of silver, right? He had, not the entire ability, that was the wrong way of putting it. He had all the know-how and all the crafting ability to create the menorah. He had the complete capability, except he cannot create a menorah without having silver, right? Silver must be provided. Right? There must be silver for him to make the menorah. So it is the very fact that he creates something from something, that his creation is dependent on something other than himself to exist. For this very reason, therefore, at one point he only has the ability to create, and then later, when he takes that ability and applies it to the actual material of the silver, he has actually created the menorah. The distinction between his ability to form the menorah and the actual menorah is dependent on the fact that there is a space, there is a conceptual difference between his ability and the actual thing. The thing can only become actual with the help of silver, with the help of some external cause outside of himself. Right? So therefore, until he is able to bring his contribution and the silver together, there is no actual thing. It remains in potentiality. So there's a firm potential actual distinction. He is able to do something, but only with the help of the silver can he actually do it. On the other hand, God, there is no silver involved in the process of creating something from nothing. There is absolutely nothing involved. Right? God is the sole source of the thing that he creates. Therefore, it makes no sense to speak of a distinction between God's ability to create and actually creating. Because what are you fundamentally saying? You're saying he has all of his aspect, everything that he has the ability to do, he has. But he needs some external thing, some canvas upon which to write this creation which is outside of him, right? Which is not the case. That's not something from nothing. That's something from something. So if it is truly something from nothing, then really there is no distinction between potential and actual. The ability of God to create the world and the actual creation of the world, right? What we've been calling the Koach Eloki, Ruach Piv, the breath of God's mouth, the godly power with which God is speaking the world into being, right? And the world itself are literally synonymous. There is no making a distinction between them. right? There is no one is the potential for the other. It doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be a potential because there is no further step, if you understand what I'm saying, upon which to write his power. There is no silver necessary in which this potential needs to be actualized. There is simply nothing. So if God has the potential, he has the actual. This is called in Chassidus, Ein Keach Chaser Peil L'Mayla. There is no potential lacking in actuality above. If God has the potential to do something, then it is actually done. It's synonymous. There is no need to actualize his potential.
Well, does that put a limitation that says God can't create anything else?
No, because the potential still has to exist. In other words, the potential itself is a creation, so to speak, like God, in comparison to God, right? God has the sort of. It's very complicated. It's a very deep idea,
So
like I said.
Capability, potential, and reality. Hashem's capable of anything.
Depends what you mean by capable. It depends what you mean by capable.
Hashem does whatever.
Well, let me put it to you this way. This idea of Ein Keach Chaser Peil, that there is no potential lacking actuality within God, is actually used as a proof by the Rebbe Rashab that the one of the explanations in Kabbalah for the world's creation must not be true. Because it says in the Kabbalah, I believe in the Eitz Chaim, if I'm not mistaken, that the reason why God created the physical universe is l'galei shleimus kechesav, is to reveal the perfection of his potentialities. Right? If God only has the ability to create the world, right, then clearly he is lacking in something, and only actualizing it makes it actual, right? In human life, when you say someone has lots of potential, that's not a compliment, right? The real thing, the potential is lacking without an actualization. So some people want to. So some people. Some wanted to say that God created the universe because he had potentials that needed actualizing. There was no actual universe. He only had a potential for the universe. And the Rebbe Rashab fundamentally goes through it and explains that this whole position is ridiculous, right? The actual physical universe is not actualizing any potential that God has. The very fact that God has the potentials indicates that they're already actualized. Or to put it in more Kabbalistic terms, the universe already exists entirely in a much more real way in God's infinite light than it exists in the physical universe at all. Right? There's no the Orein Sof, which is really an expression of both everything that is possible and everything that isn't possible, right? It's the complete expression of God, right? What that means is that literally everything that can and everything that cannot, right, logically exist is expressed within Orein Sof. It's present there in Orein Sof. And you cannot say that that's just a potential for a world and not an actual one, because those potentials by God are the actualization. There is no real distinction between potential and actualization. But we're getting way off track, and if we go down that rabbit hole, that could go on forever. Right? That's very famous. It's a whole other distinction.
He just isn't taking it off the shelf.
So there is no potential and actual distinction, which goes back to the prior point, right? We were referring to what we were speaking about last week, that the difference between the reflection in the mirror and God's creation of the universe is that the creation of the universe takes place in the same place as God, right? And from this explanation, we're already seeing the beginning of that explanation, right? The beginning of that explanation. The very fact that God is the sole cause of the universe and creates it something from nothing, right, indicates that the universe is not created on some sort of canvas or in some sort of external reality, like the silversmith creates the silver, right? Because God is the sole cause, this indicates that where does the universe exist? It exists within the power that creates it. The power that creates it and it are just the same thing. Right? They are entirely united, right? But let's continue the metaphor. We're going to refine this understanding in a much clearer way, in a way that avoids various forms of heresy and accident mistakes. Okay. So, That's our metaphor so far. Our metaphor so far is you have the sun shines its radiance upon the earth, and because the sun is the sole cause of the light, therefore, just as the light exists on earth, so too it must exist in the sun. Right? Because where else can the light come from except from the sun? Right? In fact, the Alter Rebbe actually says in chapter 33 of the Likutei Amarim, which we'll talk about maybe next time, God willing, a little more, that the light in the sun is actually more powerful than it is outside of the sun, which once you realize that the light in the sun is actually nothing, right, it becomes a question of what does it mean it's a more powerful nothing, which we'll maybe talk about more next week, or next time we learn, God willing. So let's continue. Second line on page 854. So just as the light is outside of the sun, because the sun is the sole source of the light, it must be within the sun as well. Continues the Alter Rebbe. Rak shesham b'mekemei mamish. It is only that there, in the literal place of the sun, nechshav haziv hazeh la'ayin ve'efes mamish. This light is considered as absolutely nothing. Let's pause there. Step 1, the sun is the sole cause of the light. Step 2, therefore, the light must be within the sun just as it is outside of the sun. Right? Step 3 is that what is this light when it is within the sun? The light, when it's within the sun, is considered as absolute nothingness in comparison to the sun, obviously, in addition to the sun. Very simply, in the metaphor, very simply, the ray must be considered as nothing within the sun. Right? When we say the light is in the sun, and this really is as we say in Yiddish, ausgehalten. It makes sense in physics as well, right? It makes sense. Good evening. It makes sense in physics as well that obviously there is no ray of sun within the sun as it is outside of the sun, right? For the very simple reason that you have a sun there. Right? In other words, I have the table here and I don't have light inside the table, even though light is streaming at its surface all the time. You know why? Because two things don't exist in the same place. You have the sun, you have the thing, and you have the light. Right? So now we have a very interesting, almost not really a paradox, but there's a tension. There's an interesting tension. What's the tension? The sun is the sole source of the light, and the light must exist in the sun. However, where the sun is, there's obviously only sun. There is no light. Right? There is no light in the sun. There's sun stuff there, right? There's all the molecules and atoms and gases and whatever the sun is made of. There's sun there. There's no light there. Right? Light is from the surface of the sun shines light, right? The ray of light as it exists, as sort of going in a straight line and just sort of into the sun. It doesn't go past the surface of the sun. There's no, it's not all radiating out from this tiny little point, infinitesimal point in the middle of the sun, and there's just a ray going for millions of miles or thousands of miles into the sun, however big the sun is, right? That's obviously not how it is. There's no ray of light in the sun. It's considered as absolute nothingness. What does that mean? So what does that mean? On the one hand, there must be light in the sun. Because if there's no light in the sun, where does the light come from? Mysteriously, right? On the other hand, there cannot be light within the sun because the sun's there. Right? So the explanation is, it's both. There is a light, but it's not in the form of light. Again, there's light, but it's not in the form of light. There's light, but it doesn't have what we call in Chassidus, it doesn't have a metzius. It doesn't have a metzius. It isn't a distinguishable existence from the stuff of the sun. Or in other words, to put it even more simply, the fact that there is light in the sun means that the sun itself shines. The stuff of the sun, which is the case, is illuminated. The stuff of the sun actually gives off light, right? Even though there is no ray of light in the sun as there is outside of the sun, but the sun itself is illuminated, right? The sun itself is illuminated, and it is this illumination which gives off, right, the ray of light which goes outside of the sun. This is all a metaphor, right? As we're going to get to eventually, probably only the next time we learn, or even the time after, who knows. You have the ray of light which comes from the sun, right? There is no ray of light like that inside the sun. However, the sun itself is lit. The sun itself shines, right? Not externally. Internally, there is a light to the sun. There is a quality of light to the stuff of the sun. Those gases and molecules and atoms are emitting light, right? Sort of in an internal sense, not an external sense, if you know what I mean, right? The same way that if you similar to how if you turn the light on in a room, right, the room is dark and you turn the light on, right, what's really changed in the room? The answer is both everything and nothing, right? On the one hand, nothing has been added to the room. On the other hand, everything now is reflecting light. Everything is illuminated, right? Similarly, the sun, there is no light within the sun per se, but the sun is illuminated. It has it has a quality of light. That quality of the sun being a light is not the same as the ray of the sun which comes from the sun. This is what the Alter Rebbe is saying.
This is a thermal reaction you're describing.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely, exactly.
No, it's a guy with a switch.
It's a hamster on a wheel. It's a really big hamster.
Really big.
So you have this interesting state. You have the light of the sun can come from nowhere but the sun. On the other hand, the light in the sun is not really light. The light in the sun is really sun, right? Right? You have, the sun could be dark, so there is an existence of light there. In other words, in addition to the actual stuff of the sun, right? You could have gases and helium and whatever's in the sun. That's not a light, so to speak, right? You could have it be inert and not be giving off light.
You could have a black hole, effectively, where
or whatever, yeah, whatever, or yeah, whatever.
So where is this going?
This is all a metaphor. You came in the middle. Is the problem? This is all a metaphor for the creation of the world. And so we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. But to understand the metaphor first is the first step. So,
creation from nothing.
So this light comes from nowhere else other than the sun, and so therefore it must be in the sun. But the way it is in the sun is not as light. The way it is in the sun is as sun, not as light. Is the emphasis. So there is light in the sun, but since the sun is the source of the light, and since the entire existence of the light in the sun is just an aspect of the sun, it is just the sun being itself, so to speak, therefore you cannot really say that within the sun, light exists additionally to the sun. Right? That's what we're saying. We're saying that 854 on the second line, we said there in its own place, in the sun, the radiance is considered naught and complete nothingness. Right? Nobody would point at the sun, meaning its actual internal, the internal body, the internal sun stuff that's within the sun, and say, look, I see a ray of light. Right? Ridiculous. You point at the sun and say, I see the sun, right? The rays of light come from the surface. And yet, the sun itself, the sun stuff is illuminated. This is the distinction that we're making. So why would you not call it light? Says the Alter Rebbe in the third line here. Ki batel mamesh b'metzius l'gabe guf kader hashemesh. Because it is absolutely non-existent in comparison to the actual body, the actual stuff of the sun. Shu makar ha'er va'aziv hazeh, which is the source of this ray. This radiance and light are simply a ray, or radiance, an illumination which shines from the body of the sun itself. One second here, sorry. It is only in empty space, the space of the universe, tachas kol hashamayim v'ala aretz, and under the heavens and on the earth, she'ein kan guf kader hashemesh b'metzias, where the body of the sun does not exist. Nira kan ha'er v'azivazeh leyesh mamesh le'ein kol. Does the light appear as a literal, as something separate from the sun to everyone, right? You would say, there's the sun, you would point, and there's the sunlight. and there's two distinct things, right? In the sun itself, this distinction does not exist. There is just the sun which is illuminated. There is not the light and the sun. Clear? The Neifel Alav Khan finishes, says Alter Rebbe, and here the term Shem Yesh, the name Yesh, the name of an existence, truly falls upon the light. The light truly exists when it is outside of the sun. You would actually call it something. You would say there is something there. There is sunlight. As opposed to when it is within its source, in the actual body of the sun, Ein Neifel Alav Shem Yesh Klal. The name of a yesh, the name of a distinct being, of an existence, does not fall on it at all. Rak shem ayin ve'efes. We can only call it nothingness. This is the metaphor. We're not actually finished with the metaphor. This is the beginning of the metaphor. So you have a few parts. You have the light, which must be traced back to the sun. And therefore there must be light within the sun because the sun is the sole creator of the light. Then you have, but the light cannot be within the sun as itself. Therefore, there is here a distinction. There's light and it exists in two ways. There's light as it exists within the sun. When it's within the sun, it does not really exist for itself at all. There's only sun stuff. But the sun stuff is illuminated. And that in turn gives off light from the surface of the sun, which shines down into the world, where the light actually attains a certain degree of separation from the sun, because the sun is up there and the light is down here. But when you cannot make that distinction and say the sun is there and the light is there, and rather the sun and light are in the same place, then you wouldn't say that the light even truly exists. This is the beginning of the metaphor. I want to do one more point here and then we'll end. Especially since we're going to have to do this all again next time when there's more people, God willing. So it'll be a good review. Ki be'emes husham la'ayin ve'efes mamish, ein meir sham rak makere levadoi, shu guf Hashem shameir ve'efes biladoi. There in the sun, it is absolutely non-existent, because the only thing that shines there is the source of the light itself, the sun stuff. Shu guf Hashem shameir ve'efes biladoi, and there's nothing other than it. In other words, the emphasis here, with this I'll finish, and this last idea. The emphasis here by the Alter Rebbe, why is the ray of the light nothing when it's within the sun? Right? Why is it nothing when it's there? Right? It's not just, here's the point the Alter Rebbe is making. He says when it's in its makar, when it's in its source, which is the key word. It's not just that the sun is an overwhelming reality in general, right? Such that the ray is irrelevant. How can you compare the light of a single ray to the light of the sun itself, right? Obviously there it's considered as nothing, right? That's not what we're saying. We're saying something deeper, which is vitally important to understanding the metaphor. We're saying that the light is absolutely nothing within the sun because it's within its source. That's why it's absolutely nothing. Because it is within its source, because it is within the source of its own creation, therefore it cannot be distinct from that source, right? In other words, there's two ways that something can be nullified, right? Externally or within its own source, right? For example, an example given in Chassidus, this is taken from, I think, I'm not sure where the original source is actually. There's a metaphor of a torch in the daylight, shraga batihara, of a torch in the middle of the day, and this torch in broad daylight, right? Maya hane, what does it help? Right? In other words, if you take a torch out, a lit torch, right, that's all aflame, into the bright street in the middle of the day, right, it is absolutely nullified in the daylight. In what sense is it nullified? It's nullified because it's considered as nothing. Because in light of the...
Like starlight in the middle of the day.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, well said. In light of the incredible power of the daylight, the torch is contextually rendered irrelevant. Right? In this context, it has no power. However, this bittul, this nullification which it has, is not absolute. In fact, it's extremely conditional. Why? Because as soon as the sun goes down, all of a sudden the torch is extremely useful. Right? You take away the daylight, which is an external force upon this torch. It is nullified to something outside of itself that it has no essential connection to. So when you take away the sun, the torch all of a sudden becomes something again. It goes from nothing to something. It's only nothing contextually. It's only nothing because it happens to be within this external source. That's not what we're saying. The world, or the ray of the sun in the sun, is much more like the torch that's put in the bonfire. You take the torch that's on fire, you take it over to a bonfire, and you stick the fiery end into the bonfire, right? And the fires merge together, right? The fires merge together. There's now one fire, right? So the fire is within the source of the fire. The two fires have become one, right? You could say even nicer if you want, you're initially lighting the torch in the bonfire. Anyway, there's different ways you can look at it. But the point is that when the torch fire is within the bonfire, right, it's also nullified. Why is it nullified? Not because the bonfire is overwhelmingly much larger or more powerful than the fire of the torch, although that may be true as well. But it's nullified within the bonfire because really the fire that's on the torch is really just of the same thing. It's really just an expression. It really just comes from that same fire. It's not like the daylight versus the torch, which are two sort of totally unrelated things, right? The fire of the torch and the fire of the bonfire is really the same fire, right? The metaphor is not perfect, but it's sort of okay. The fundamental point is this. When you take away the bonfire with the torch still in it, what's left? Nothing. There's no fire at all, right? When you take away the daylight, the torch all of a sudden shines in the night. It becomes something again. But because the nullification of the torch to the fire is so absolute, it's really one fire, if you were to just take away that whole fire then, right, there would be nothing left. The torch in the bonfire is nullified not because the fire is more powerful than it, but because its light, its fire, is really the same as the fire in the bonfire. It's nullified within its source, so to speak. Right? So the only way to make the fire of the torch not nothing from the bonfire is not by taking the bonfire away, because when you take the bonfire away, you take the torch away too. The torch fire away too. The only way you can make the light of the torch into something is you pull the torch out of the fire. You pull the torch out of the fire, you make something called mikum, you make space, right? All of a sudden you can point there's the fire of the bonfire, and you can point there and say there's the fire of the torch, right? If there is room for the fire of the bonfire to leave and go external to the original source, then it can become something. Right, this is the metaphor. It's actually worse than the light from the sun because it has its own issues. It's really not a very good metaphor if you look into it too deeply. But on the surface, it's nice. So where do you make so the light in the sun is the same thing. When the light is within the sun, and we say there is no ray there, there's just the actual body of the sun itself, right? We don't mean that it's overwhelmed by some external force. We mean that it's totally one with the sun. In other words, if you were to take away the sun, it wouldn't be that there was a ray left over. If you were to take away the sun, there would be nothing left over, obviously, is the point, right? The light that's within the sun is totally united with the sun. The only way that the light gains any non-unity with the sun, gains any external reality from the sun of its own, as the Alter Rebbe says, is when it leaves the body of the sun and travels outward and shines down upon the earth or whatever. Right? It shines outward from the sun all of a sudden because there is space, because there is somewhere for the light to go. Therefore, you can say there's the light and there's the sun. But barring that, the light and the sun are absolutely united. The light is just an aspect of the sun. The light is totally included within the sun, like the torch within the bonfire. There's only really one thing here. There's just the sun. The sun happens to be shining, right? The sun happens to have a certain internal illumination. True. So it is the source of the light. But within the body of the sun, what's there? Only sun. You would never say there's light there. There's only sun there. And the only sun which is illuminated is what produces the light which goes on outside of the sun to become something. All of this, in every detail, is vitally important to understanding what the Alter Rebbe says about creation of the universe, something from nothing. God willing, next time we'll try and get into all of the details of what this metaphor means. We're going to have to separate the metaphor and what it's a metaphor for into 2 separate weeks. But God willing, we'll do a healthy review and go over all of this again. God willing.